Hi everyone. Sorry it's been a while since I've done an updated video for you all. This video applies primarily to my 1302 online students, both in section 80 and 83L, but it will also give some background information and be posted for my face-to-face students in 95L, 95M, and 04 this semester. And I may use it in future semesters as well. This video deals primarily with pulling all the ideas together for creating your poetry essay. And as I told many of my face-to-face students, this video is actually intended to be a more in-depth discussion, well, I guess lecture, about how to do that, how this process should go. So if you have not yet done so and you are an online student, you need to be working already in the second, not the first, the second discussion board and have viewed those lectures and these poems. You need to have done that, okay? A lot of what I talk about today will not make sense if you have not watched these things and participated in those lectures. So please be sure and do that. Now, the second lecture here, this poetry lesson 2 that deals with form and content, that lecture actually is an older lecture that's using page numbers primarily from the 12th edition of our textbook, not the 13th. So please don't be confused by the page number references there. You can use the table of contents in the 13th edition to find most of the poems I refer to here. You also need to have read all these chapters related to the poetry unit quiz to help you develop these ideas. Of course, the essay is only a couple weeks out at this point for many of you, and that means you need to make sure that you understand these concepts and how to create this. Now, this says here that you will be assigned in an email a poem by me. I'm actually not going to do that. What I'm going to do instead is allow you to select a poem, any poem in the textbook, and you can use the discussion board as a place to do this, that has not been covered by me in lecture and that has not been selected by one of your peers, mentioned by one of your peers in the lecture or in the discussion board. So please, please, please get involved in the discussion board so you can avoid, we can avoid having 100 papers about the same poem. Okay, so let's get started. We've talked about in these lectures, if you've been paying any attention, a lot of concepts. So first I want to just review some of the key concepts that we've discussed and how they relate to developing the essay. What you are writing is an explication. Now, explication essay, an explication essay does a number of things. If you look in your textbook in the writing section, there is a chapter on writing about poems. It is actually chapter 44, I believe. Yeah, chapter 44, and you can review this. They use the poem Design by Robert Frost, which is one I will not allow you to write on, but they mention elements of that. And they talk briefly about explication. An explication paper, literally an unfolding, and a writer explains an entire poem in detail, unraveling its complexities. So an explication essay explains in detail a concept and unravels its complexities. So if you think about what we've been doing all semester with poetry, we've been talking about exactly what is poetry. What makes a poem a poem? And I gave you that great quote by Louis Turco, one of my favorite critics and thinkers about poetry, where he basically says poetry is the art of language. So when we think about art, the first thing that normally comes to mind is this idea of painting, right? Painting is when I say art, usually the first concept that comes to most people's mind are paintings. And painters have a lot of supplies that they use to create a painting, right? If we think about the elements of painting, you have the paints, and with those you have oil, and you have watercolor, and you have pastels, which are a type of texture like the crayons. You have acrylic, and on and on and on. You have canvases, which you can use cotton. There are other materials, right? You can paint on wood. You can paint on metal, on cloth, and on and on and on. And then if you think about brushes, right? There's all different types of brushes. You think about the lighting that you use to create the painting or to exhibit the painting. You think about the frame that goes around the painting. All these different elements go into making a painting what it is and into our interpretation of what a painting is. Well, poetry is no different, and that's exactly what we've been doing all semester. So, during this whole unit, I've been trying to give you the terms and the specific tools and elements that poets use to create a poem so that you can then talk about how you see those things in a poem. Right? So that's what the explication is all about. It's discussing a poem, and this time, our concept is a poem, discussing a poem's elements, illustrating for the reader that you understand how the poem's put together. Now, since poetry is the art of language, we have two primary ways of presenting language, right? I'm going to create a table here for you so you can see what I'm talking about visually to help you understand this. So we have really actually three ways of using language and presenting language. The first way is the way that most of you are familiar with, and this is visual language. And this is reading to self, what we call silent reading. And this is how most of us now in the 21st century interact with literature. Now, this is what I've been referring to in lecture as syntax or typography. And the reason, if you think about it, typography works is because if you think about photography, right? That's the creating of photos. Typography is using type, and that's what we're doing. I mean, that's what fonts are. Fonts and word processors are types. So when we deal with the typography, we're dealing with the shape of the symbols. And in our language, symbols refer to, in this context, a symbol refers to the alphanumeric object that represents a sound or idea. And for many of you, that might be weird to think about, but it goes back to my idea of how CAT does not equal. Now I'll look up the picture again so we can plug it in. because I'm going to provide these notes that I'm typing for you also with the video. Does not equal this. And yet, in our mind, it does. Or, you might have had a different image than that. I just picked the first one to illustrate. But you get the point that this is not necessarily the same thing. So those are just symbols on a page that represent sounds, ka, t, and when we put them together, they create the image in our mind of that object. The same thing can go with one or the letter I, which both equal one object. One is a Roman numeral, one is an Arabic numeral. You could say the same thing for 5 or the letter V. Okay, so when we think about shapes of a symbol in typography, we're also dealing with things like italics, font size, right? Font size, and let's get a really crazy font that looks very different than what we have here. Font type. All of those things create different meanings. So when we change the symbol on the page, we change the meaning. So there's a big difference between lowercase I, see even the autocorrect, lowercase I, it won't let me put a lowercase, is very different than I. They have different effects, right? So even something as simple as lowercase and uppercase letters can change the meaning of words. Context creates everything. Shape creates everything. Type creates everything. So we have to be constantly aware of those things, particularly with poets like E.E. Cummings, who really uses font size, shape, type, and something also called field of the page, which I've referred to before. This is the location of text symbol on the page. So if you look at something like grasshopper, for example, we can pull that back up and think about how that works as a poem. We'll go to the Academy because we like the Academy. You look at this and how it works on the poem. We start over here with the word grasshopper and completely disorganized. It takes a while to figure out that that's what he's talking about. And then we see who, as we look up now, gathering into the leap. And notice how the movement of the text across the field of the page is mimicking what the grasshopper is doing when it finally becomes clearly a grasshopper. So as the text moves and changes shape, it changes meaning. That's what we're talking about here with field of the page, location of text and symbol on the page can affect meaning interpretation. Okay, so there's all of that element, but then just also on a basic level, you have the organization of text on a page. So this issue is, does the poet use stanzas or paragraphs. Because remember, poetry can be written in prose or in verse. Does the poet use line breaks? Does the poet extend grammatically ideas across lines? And in poetry we call that enjambment, but that word does not appear in your textbook because it's a little more advanced. Does the poet use complete syntactical units on each line? And we call that in stop. Does the poet use punctuation or spacing to signify a pause in a line internally in, if I can type today, sorry y'all, internally in a line of poetry? We call that caesura. And there's a couple different spellings of it. The CE is fine as well. I just was taught to spell it the old way. And the textbook shows you both ways. If the poet uses stanzas, what are their shapes? And then you have the different types of stanzas, right? You have the types of stanzas like, let me see here if I can make this work. I'm trying to do the A-B stuff here. You have the stanza with the different types of lines. You have a single line. You have what's called a couplet. That's 2 lines. You have tercet. You have quatrain, which is the most common, the 4-line. Quinquain, 5-line. Sestet. Heptet, or septet, depending on who you talk to. I'll use septet. And then you have the octave, or octet. Okay? So you have those types of stanzas based on how many lines are in each stanza. And then you would ask questions like, is the pattern consistent? How does the pattern reflect the content or central concerns of the poem? What is dictating this organization? So just on a purely traditional level, even with just plain old poems, you have, I'm not talking about concrete or conceptual like Cummings, just a poem like something like Yeats or Frost writes, you have these different types of stanzas, and they also are purposeful. So this is all the typographical elements, and you notice a lot of these things also overlap with some of the sonic elements we're going to talk about now. So the next way we can think about this is oral language, reading out loud, reciting, performing, and the language that's tied to that. And for me, traditionally, most of the language that's tied with this is going to be tied with those concepts of sound and rhythm that are in your textbook. So we're going to start with just dealing with the sound concepts. And if you recall, there's a lot in your textbook that deals with this. I'm not going to write every vocabulary word down for you because the vocabulary words appear at the end of each chapter. And one of the things I'm testing for is your ability to use these terms. So if you go to the song chapter, they give you some song types because people write poems not just in traditional forms like the sonnet, the villanelle, and the sestina. They also write poems and what they sometimes refer to as modes, like the ode, the elegy, the ballad, and many of these poems are based on song. Remember, poetry was originally principally dealt with in this way. That's why it's one of the oldest literary forms. This oral language was the original concern of poetry, and that's why so often when we think about poetry, what we think about is the sound of it. So there's some terminology in here that I think is really important to understand when you are analyzing poems. Primarily this concept of a stanza, which we talked about, which literally means the room. So if you think about it as a room, what does a room contain, right? It literally means room. That concept's very, very important. Then this idea of refrain, you have refrains, and here they talk about terminal and internal. You could also talk about this literary form. This is not in your textbook, but anaphora, repeated phrase at the beginning of lines. You have that possibility too. You need to be able to identify that. Refrains, that's also repetition. They talk about different types like madrigals, not as important unless you're actually writing about madrigals, but more important is this idea of ballads and ballades. And of course there's information on the textbook on those types, those forms, and so I'm not going to really go over that too much. Blues and rap, what separates those and what is similar across them. Uh, those concepts are really, really helpful to understand. I don't talk about them too much in the main lectures because they're sort of, I assume that they're more familiar than the things we deal with like rhyme. Now in the textbook they have this weird spelling of rhyme. They spell it R-I-M-E. I prefer the old spelling R-H-Y-M-E. Either one's okay, but very important that you're aware that there's two different ways of spelling it. So I'm going to just put down some of these terms for you that I think you really need to be familiar with in this context and be able to identify when a poet is using these things in the poem and why they might be using these things. So it's not enough to just identify them and say they're using them, but why are they using them? Why are they using them? What is the benefit of using them? How does it change the way we interpret the poem itself? Um, Let me show you here some of these other ones. And these all go in, again, the oral language, because what they're doing is they're trying to please the ear or draw attention to certain things through the ear itself. So you have the types of rhyme as well. Let's correct that spelling. So these are different sounds, but then we have our types of rhyme. Actually, I need to add to this. Actually, yeah, there we go. Our types of rhyme include things like exact rhyme. We have slant rhyme, masculine rhyme, feminine rhyme, consonants. You have some of these ideas like end rhyme, medial or internal rhymes, and I rhyme, sometimes thought of as slant, or not slant, sight rhyme. And you would need to be able to identify those as well and explain how the poem is using those to please the ear or to challenge the ear. Now the next one is the one many students find the most difficult, and that's the idea of rhythm. And remember, with rhythm you have our language is accentual, syllabic, but you also have syllabic rhythms, and a poem might be organized that way, and you have accentual rhythms. Either one can create organization, but most English language poems are going to be both accentual and syllabic. What this means is we count the syllables and the stresses, and we apply a name to a line based on its dominant metrical foot and the number of stresses in the line. So the different metrical feet we have are metrical feet. We have first the, I'm going to scroll that down a bit so it's on the same page. We have first the most common, the iamb. Then we have the trochee. We have the anapest, the dactyl, the spondee, the pyrrhic, and then the monosyllabic foot. Those are in order from most common to least common metrical feet. Then we have types of metrical lines, and we have manometer or monometer, dimeter, trimeter, tetrameter, pentameter, hexameter, heptameter, and we don't typically go up into the eights, but you can. I'm not going to. So when we do this, we call this scanning the line, or scansion. We use that idea to help us see where the stresses are. And in many poems, the stresses themselves are tied directly to the meaning of the line. So if there's emphasis, you know that that means that line is important. If there's emphasis, you know that that means that line is very, very important. So keep that concept in mind. Okay. Um, Now, we also deal with the things like line endings in here, but you notice again, this is a place where these ideas overlap. Chances are, if the poem is written in lines, it is written that way in order to create to create verse, to be what we would think of as verse. If it has pauses, it's written with an ear and eye to sound. So it's very important to keep these concepts in mind. You also have the idea of rising meter. This is a meter that is primarily iambic, and you have falling meter, a meter that is primarily trochaic. And I want you to keep in mind that the sonic element, the oral element of poetry, is also a physical element, because when you read the poem out loud to yourself, it causes you to read it differently. It causes you to read it differently, to think about it differently. Um, and of course, you're physically moving your mouth, your tongue, you're touching the tip of your tongue to your teeth or to the top of your mouth and slamming it down on the bottom of your mouth, and that's creating different effects. Your heart starts to race depending on certain rhythmical elements in how the line is designed. And poets are very much aware of this. They were, we as readers were much more conscious of the physicality of language uh, earlier in the century than we are now. We've become very disconnected from this. However, if you think about those slam performances, the poems you saw in the Deaf Poetry Jam, series that I showed you all in the lecture videos, those are very physical performances. The body plays a huge role in the expression of the ideas, which leads to the third section, which is ideational language, comprehension, and interpretation. And these are things like figures of speech, and there are some primary ones in the textbook that you should know at this point: simile, metaphor, personification. You also have metonymy, which I always forget how to spell. Thank God for spell check. Synecdoche. See if I got it right. Oh, I got it right this time. Pun and paradox and irony. All of these are figures of speech or constructions of language that create different ideas. You also have the concept of image and symbol, and in this context, we're not talking about the alphanumeric symbol, although it's very similar, but we're talking about objects in the world that the word represents. And so the word has a real world referent, and that referent symbolizes a concept. You can think about the more traditional symbols like the cross, stop signs, the color red, crescents, clouds, flowers, these sorts of things, particularly the rose. These are words that are um, full of symbolic meaning. And when we choose to use these words, we are evoking all that symbolic meaning. So word choice And in this instance, we're not just thinking about the word context. We're not thinking about where the words are on the page. We're thinking about the actual words themselves. That's why I had you read that chapter early on about words, and I hope you'll go back and review it. This also deals with the total organization of language into forms like the sonnet, which you have the two types, the main types that they talk about. There are a lot more than this, but you have the Italian and the English, or the Petrarchan and the Shakespearean. You should be able to identify a sonnet if it is a sonnet, and what tradition it is actually speaking to are challenging because a lot of poets decide to break the forms based on these things. Oh, let me add that in here to the rhyme section too, because we also have rhyme scheme. So you have the sonnet, and you have the sestina, which is one of my favorites. You have the villanelle. You have these different forms, closed forms, which I hate that term. But there are also, I would say, fixed forms. And these are forms that are developed that may not have a tradition behind them, but are used, and we'll look at one in a minute in a second video related to this. I'm going to split up these videos into two videos, one by Theodore Rutke. And then you also have the open form poems, which still have formal elements to them and are sometimes quite metrical themselves. So that's the ideational level. That's of a poem. Even formal patterns themselves can be revealing, you know, like the stanzaic patterns, the quatrain and the tercet and the couplet. All those things have tradition. Syllabic verse, organizing by syllables, again, has a tradition that when a poet decides to do that instead of the accentual syllabic and organize their verse that way, why are they doing that? If they decide to write in prose, what possible reason would make a prose poem better than a verse poem? Because we usually use verse to create heightened language. So talking about all these concerns is very, very important. I'm going to conclude this video for now, and I want you to think about these terms, make sure you understand these vocab terms before going to the next video. I'm going to put this in my online classes in that second discussion for poetry. And use this as a starting point for analyzing your poem, and then I'm going to do a model of this analysis in the second video.